Welcome. My name is Dave Jones, and I'm the director of the Climate Risk Initiative at UC Berkeley School of Law's Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, or CLE. We're very pleased to co-host with the European Union this webinar on the EU's renewed sustainable finance strategy and the green recovery. Sustainable finance generally refers to taking into consideration environmental, social, and governance factors when making investment decisions. In the EU's policy context, sustainable finance is understood as finance to support economic growth while reducing pressures on the environment and taking into account social and governance considerations. The 2015 Paris Climate Agreement includes a commitment to align financial flows with a pathway towards a low carbon and climate resilient economy. The EU Sustainable Finance Strategy and Action Plan is an ambitious and comprehensive effort to channel private and public capital towards a low carbon and sustainable economy, and to make the investments necessary to meet the EU's commitment in the Paris Agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. We're privileged today to have with us Martin Spolc, who's the head of sustainable finance at the European Commission. Martin will share with us an overview of the EU's Sustainable Finance Action Plan and the effort to update it through a renewed sustainable finance strategy. After Martin's remarks, they'll take questions. Please pose your questions through the chat feature of the Zoom call, and then I'll relay the questions to Martin at the conclusion of his remarks. With that, I'm very privileged and pleased to turn this over to Martin Spolc. Thank you.
Hi, Dave. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I am now trying to connect to my screen so that I can share the slides with you. I hope that you can see them. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I mean, for us as the European Commission, it's extremely important to have a regular dialogue, not only with European stakeholders, but in particular with global stakeholders. This file is posing several challenges, not only in the European Union, but globally. And we are really very committed to have a regular dialogue with also US stakeholders. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to present to you today where we have got, what is our latest thinking about sustainable finance in the context of the crisis and the recovery, and also share some latest thinking about the future, about the preparation of the next steps, especially we call it renewed sustainable finance strategy, kind of action plan 2.0. So in the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes, I will give you a crash course about what have we achieved so far. There has been a lot, so you might be a bit overwhelmed. At the same time, I don't want to sound too complacent because given the challenges we all are facing, we cannot be complacent, and we really need to now look forward to the future. And that's exactly why I want to focus more on the second part, on the context of the recovery, and as well on the context of the future of the renewed sustainable finance strategy that we are developing as we speak. So first of all, let me remind you that we started to work on sustainable finance already 3 years ago. We set up a group of high-level experts in 2017, and we asked them to advise the Commission what we can do to promote more sustainability in the way how financial sector works. And the result was very promising, was very rich. The high-level expert group chaired by Christian Timman delivered a very substantive piece, and it was very easy for the Commission to follow up on that advice. And in March 2018, we adopted a very ambitious action plan on financing sustainable growth, where we have defined 3 main objectives. The first objective was to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investment. The rationale for this first objective was that the investment needs that need to be filled in order to meet all the ambitious targets in the area of environment, social, and other sustainability aspects are extremely high. To give you an example, only in the European Union, only to meet the current energy and climate targets, 2030 targets, we would need approximately at least 260 billion euros in addition what has been already envisaged. if you add to that also the investment needs for other broader environmental objectives, which are amounting to 130 billion, you end up easily with numbers like 400 billion a year. And it's clear that these numbers cannot be filled by public investment and by the public sector only. So we do need to mobilize the private sector and need to find ways how the private investments can be unlocked by a smart design of public support. So on the left side, you see the 5 actions that are supposed to promote this first objective, which is reorienting capital flows. In other words, shift the trillions. Very quickly, taxonomy is obviously in the heart of this strategy, and I will say a few words about it in a minute. We are also developing standards and labels, a standard for the green bond. We are developing a label, green label for retail investors so that they know which products are substantially contributing to climate and environment. Finally, I mentioned that we are trying to align the way how public investments are done together with the private investments. So this is action number 3. Action number 4 is a very important one. This is about the requirement for investment advisors to ask their retail clients whether they have any preference for environmental, social, or governance aspects, considerations. And if the retail clients say, yes, we do, then there has to be an appropriate follow-up by the investment advisors and asset managers. Finally, action number 5 is about developing climate benchmarks, and we have already proposed some legislative proposals. On the right side of the screen, you see actions that are related to the 2 other objectives. The second objective is to make sure that the financial sector is able to withstand pressure and able to manage risks coming from climate change and environmental degradation. And here I would like to mention in particular action number 7, where we proposed a legislative requirement for financial market participants to disclose how they comply with fiduciary duties, how they incorporate ESG considerations in their decision-making processes, and also if they sell products that are deemed to be sustainable or deemed to have sustainable characteristics, they have to disclose how they have reached these conclusions. As part of the second objective, managing risks, I should also mention action number 8. This is about mainstreaming ESG considerations in the way how banks and insurance companies are managing their risks and how transparent they are about it, and also the discussions about the possible adjustments of the prudential requirements. Finally, the last objective, and certainly not the least important objective, is to promote transparency not only of the financial sector itself, but transparency of the corporate sector. So this is action number 9. And finally, action number 10 is fostering sustainability in corporate governance and promoting long-termism. I should say, before I go into the substance of the taxonomy, which is really in the heart of our strategy, that the action plan covered all 3 aspects of sustainability: E, environmental, social, and governance. But for obvious reasons, we had to decide about some prioritization. And we have decided to prioritize actions, especially focusing on the climate objectives. So we did already propose some legislative proposals that all of them have been negotiated successfully. But the priority has been really given for climate issues. Now, one issue that I would like to specifically highlight in this presentation is the role of the EU taxonomy. This slide presents to you what taxonomy is and what taxonomy is not. Taxonomy for us is a classification system that would help investors to understand better which economic activities or which economic projects would substantially contribute to meeting environmental objectives. We haven't started to work on this project because we believe that it was our wisdom in the Commission that we need to do that. This project was triggered mainly by the demands of investors and financial market participants who argued that it's very difficult for them to judge the environmental performance of different projects and economic activities. And they wanted us, policymakers, to help them with this judgment. So this tool, this taxonomy, is supposed to help investors to be able to see what really makes a difference. The taxonomy, as we have designed it, is no way an instrument that we are imposing on the financial sector. There is no requirement in our legislative actions that would impose the taxonomy on investors and telling them you have to invest in those assets and you have to divest from those. The regulatory approach that we have taken on taxonomy is that to increase transparency. Investors, financial market participants that are selling their products as green or sustainable, they have to disclose whether and to what extent they have used taxonomy. And this is the only regulatory requirement. But on top of this regulatory requirement, we would like that investors and finance and also businesses use this tool in the first place as a useful tool to help them to transition towards sustainability and sustainable financial sector and sustainable business. On the left side, you have seen that I have highlighted one bullet in bold, and that is that taxonomy should facilitate transition of polluting sectors. We have never conceived this project as a kind of green niche. I mean, you might expect that on the list of these taxonomy compliant activities, you would find the usual windmills and the activities that are already green today. But the ambition that we have taken is going much further. We wanted to identify economic activities in the sectors that are currently very polluting, but where the potential to reduce the carbon emissions would be the most significant. So that's a very important feature of the EU taxonomy that will ultimately, and that should ultimately, help the transition not only of the financial sector, but also of the businesses. I will try to be brief, but I think it's very important to explain that in the taxonomy regulation that was already successfully negotiated, we have defined 6 environmental objectives. The first 2 are related to climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And the other 4 are equally important, but they are, again, they have to wait a little bit, they have to wait 1 year, that are linked to circular economy, pollution prevention and control, biodiversity, and water and marine resources. The way how taxonomy works, there are basically 3 conditions that have to be met for a given economic activity to be deemed eligible. The first condition is that the given economic activity must substantially contribute to one of the 6 environmental objectives, and at the same time, it must not significantly harm any other of the environmental objectives. The logic of this concept has been designed in a way that if we fix one issue, we should not create problems somewhere else. So this is a novelty of the European approach. And finally, we should bear in mind that we don't only have the European Green Deal, but the Green Deal is obviously also very important for society, and we have to meet some minimum social safeguards. So the transition has to be not only green, but also just, fair, and resilient. So we need to make sure that the given economic activities are complying with certain minimum social safeguards that are, by the way, very much inspired by international norms. I mentioned a very strong partnership between the Commission and the private sector, and we would never be able to develop these projects successfully alone. So we have teamed up very quickly after the adoption of the proposal with the private sector, and we set up a group of 35 experts that was established in July 2018. We call it the Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, and we asked this group to help us developing for tools. The first one would be the technical details on the taxonomy. This is basically the actual list of the economic activities on the first 2 climate objectives, and the work had been already finalized. The first blueprint of the EU Green Bond Standard, the minimum requirements or framework for the 2 climate benchmarks that we have created in the European Union, and finally, corporate disclosures for companies, for big listed companies, when it comes to climate relevant information. I will say very quickly a few words about each. The taxonomy on climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation The first blueprint by the technical expert group was presented in March earlier this year. And the report is extremely rich. It covers, as I mentioned, all key economic sectors of our economy that you see on the right side: agriculture, manufacturing, electricity, water, transport, building, obviously energy, where again, as I mentioned, the delta, the savings of carbon can be really the most significant. The technical expert group published 2 reports. One was the actual list of the economic activities that would substantially contribute to meeting the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation objectives. But the second document, which I would strongly recommend everyone to read, was a document that should increase and improve the user friendliness of the taxonomy. The usability and user friendliness of taxonomy were 2 important features and elements of the work that we have done. And the document really explains in very plain language how useful this tool can be, not only to the financial sector, but ultimately to the businesses and to the dialogue between the businesses and financial sector. We are now working on transferring the richness of the report of the technical expert group into the EU law. And before the end of this year, the European Commission will adopt a so-called delegated act, which is the secondary law that will enshrine basically the bulk of the work of the technical expert group in the EU law. So again, by the end of this year, we will already have the first 2 objectives covered. And by the end of next year, we will develop the taxonomies for the other 4 environmental objectives. This slide is again a reminder of how useful this tool can be. Taxonomy obviously is an instrument that tells you that your environmental performance is aligned with the environmental goals that we are pursuing. In our case, it's climate neutrality by 2050 in Europe, all the 2030 energy and climate targets, and also all the key environmental goals. At the same time, it is naive and very maybe excessively ambitious to expect that everybody will be aligned with the taxonomy today and even next year. So while we would like to dream about it, we have also designed and articulated a way how the taxonomy could be used as a transition tool, a tool where you can use it to measure the progress towards meeting the objective. Nobody says that you have to be taxonomy compliant already tomorrow, but the taxonomy can be used very nicely to say how far you are away from meeting the thresholds and the criteria that are set out in the taxonomy. And you can really nicely measure progress in time, and you can use it as a very nice dynamic tool, which again is super useful not only for the financial sector, but businesses. Very quickly on the EU Green Bond Standard, this standard would be very largely based on the existing market practice. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but one upgrade that the technical expert group has proposed was the link with the EU taxonomy, which is obvious. And the second upgrade is that there will be a system of verification by accredited verifiers. In the Commission, we are obviously thinking about the EU Green Bond Standard as a voluntary standard. We don't intend to impose it on anybody, but if somebody wants to use it, we would like to make it clear what it entails. Finally, very quickly, I mean, we have also developed 2 types of climate benchmarks, which we believe would tremendously accelerate the transition. We have defined 2 types of benchmarks. The first one is the EU climate transition benchmarks, which would basically include portfolio of stocks that will be put on a decarbonization trajectory. There will be a kind of a diet of decarbonization at least 7% year on year. And then the second type of benchmark is more ambitious. That's basically a benchmark that would be consisted of portfolio or stocks that will be already in line with the Paris Climate Agreement today, which is obviously very, very ambitious. Finally, the last piece on which the technical expert group has worked very hard was the corporate reporting. And here we have incorporated all the very valuable work of the task force on climate disclosure, TCFD, into the guidelines that support the so-called non-financial reporting directive. But in Europe, we have not only taken on board everything what the TCFD has done, but we have gone even further. We have not suggested that companies should disclose how they manage risks stemming from climate, but we have also encouraged big listed companies to disclose the impact of their activities on climate. And with this logic, we would like to now proceed with the other aspects of sustainability, the other environmental goals, social goals, and governance aspects of sustainability. And we will, in the first quarter of next year, very likely in January, propose an amendment to the non-financial reporting directive in Europe, which will make this information and disclosure by corporates mandatory. I'm aware that this might be all very overwhelming, but this slide tries to summarize a little bit some of the next milestones ahead, at least for the next 1.5 years. On the left side, you see the different measures and tools that we are developing. The eco-label basically will be developed by the end of next year. The taxonomy, I already referred to the first delegated acts, the law that will provide the details on what is eligible for climate change mitigation and adaptation will be finalized by this year, by the end of this year, and the other 4 environmental objectives before the end of next year. When it comes to the disclosure by financial market participants, the law that I referred to in the beginning will be applicable already as of March next year. And the disclosures of corporates, by corporates, I mentioned that in the first quarter of next year, there will be an adoption of the legislative proposal by the Commission that will make the disclosure obligations by corporates mandatory. And finally, the climate benchmarks. We will adopt the last details on the 2 types of climate benchmarks later this month, and it will enter into application later this year, very likely in September or October. So I would pause a little bit here. This was a kind of snapshot of what has been achieved so far. Let me talk a little bit about the context of the crisis and recovery and why we believe that sustainable finance is absolutely crucial. I don't think that I have to talk a lot about the interconnection between the different ecological crises and the link between human activity and the different crises we have observed. I think that this crisis is a very clear and unfortunate example of how human activity and the different crises can interact. The issue is that these issues might really interact in a very violent way in the future, and we need to be prepared for that. The European Union and member states have taken a lot of measures to reduce the impact of the crisis on companies and households. But now, since we are approaching the stage of the sustainability agenda, and there have been some claims that argued that sustainability is expensive. Sustainability should really wait a little bit now, and that we should first resolve the impact of the crisis. And only when we resolve this crisis, we should start working on sustainability again. And this is something where we in the European Commission strongly disagree with. We believe that ultimately there is no trade-off between incentivizing a speedy economic recovery and supporting the sustainability transition. I mean, these targets that we have set out in the European Union on the 2050 climate neutrality and all the targets cannot really be postponed. On the contrary, we believe that all the public stimulus that has been now injected into our economy provides a number of great opportunities that could, in a way, accelerate the green agenda, and vice versa, the green agenda can accelerate the recovery. I would like to mention only 3 aspects where the sustainable finance narrative needs to be adapted a little bit and where we need to do better. The first aspect is resilience. we have seen that we need to work harder on making sure that the financial sector and businesses are more resilient, not only towards climate and environmental risks, but to the, again, different interactions of the crisis I have been talking about. Second, we also need to work harder on the alignment between public investment and the way how public spending is done and triggers and unlocks private investment. We have developed quite a number of tools for the private sector, but it's really relevant to think how these tools could be also used by the public sector, not only by member states in the European Union, but also by the European Union itself. And finally, I think that most of you would very likely agree that this crisis has accelerated the need to work on the social and governance aspect or dimension of sustainability. So we cannot really wait for the S and G aspects of sustainability for too long. I will not go into the details of a very ambitious recovery package that the European Commission adopted on the 27th of May. This package triggered basically additional 1.8 trillion euros that will be provided either in the form of direct support to member states or by the European Union. You see that on the slides. I am, of course, happy to share those slides with you. This package was really supposed to kickstart the economy again and use the package in the right way that would support the goals of the European Green Deal and not to undermine it. One important aspect of the recovery package that again is very relevant for sustainable finance is that there has been a clear commitment of the Commission towards this agenda, and also very important statements and principle, which is that the EU taxonomy should really guide investments in Europe's recovery towards environmentally sustainable activities. The package also announced that next year there will be a new initiative on sustainable corporate governance, which would ensure that not only environmental but also social interests are fully embedded in business strategies of companies. I will not go into the details of this. Those of you who are interested in more details about the EU package, which again provides a number of large-scale opportunities for investors, for the financial sector and businesses, I'm happy to share more details later on. Now, let me finally spend 5 minutes, and then I will pass back to Dave. A few words about the future, about the renewed sustainable finance strategy and why we are willing and why we are very keen on shifting the gear to a higher pace and higher ambition in the future. You have certainly noted that the priority number 1 for the European Union and for the European Commission is the European Green Deal. And financing this European Green Deal, sustainable finance, is a critical element of it. For that reason, we have decided that before the end of this year, very likely in November or December, the European Commission will adopt a new vision, a new strategy, a new roadmap of new set of ambitious actions. Currently, we are running a public consultation on a few ideas that we have, on a number of ideas, on a few ideas that we have, on which we are seeking stakeholders' feedback. We launched this public consultation in the beginning of April, and it will run until 15th of July this year. Very quickly, there are 3 main reasons why we need to shift the gear to a higher pace and ambition. The first one is that despite all the great efforts on the ground, the progress is not enough, and it's really not matching the numbers that I referred to. And the goals that we are now even increasing under the Green Deal require acceleration of the agenda. So we do need to have, again, another thorough thinking about what we can do better. The second reason why we are moving ahead with this new kind of vision is that so far the sustainable finance agenda has been focusing on how to green finance. But now we are thinking and shifting our thinking towards more how the financial sector can help the businesses and households to green themselves. So from, let's say, greening the finance to green to finance the green. And finally, I talked a lot about the resilience, and not only the resilience of the financial sector, but resilience of our economy and businesses overall. So that's another big lesson from this current crisis. I think that I'm really getting to the end now. The consultation document that we published in the beginning of April and is currently online is structured into 3 clusters. The first cluster is about strengthening the foundations for sustainable investment. It's basically about improving and developing new tools and frameworks for sustainable finance. The second cluster is about how to maximize impact and opportunities for citizens, investors, and companies by using these frameworks and tools. And finally, the third and last cluster is about the risks, how we can manage the risks better, and not only risks of individual institutions and companies, but how to look at the risks from a little bit more systemic point of view. The next 3 slides give you a little bit flavor about the content of the consultations and the areas that we are exploring. I will not go into the details in the interest of time, but this slide really gives you an overview of the richness and depth and breadth of the issues we are looking at. The first and maybe the most important one of the first cluster on the foundations is the disclosure by companies, by businesses, where I said we will proceed with a legislative proposal early next year, which I think will have quite some far-reaching consequences, not only for the European companies, but obviously also for the financial sector here in Europe. Maybe I would mention also at the end of the slide, you see the corporate governance. I mentioned that next year the Commission will adopt another initiative on this, and we will explore how we can promote long-termism in the way how financial sector and businesses work. The second cluster is about maximizing the impact and maximizing the opportunities for citizens, investors, and companies. And here we are looking at issues such as how to mobilize retail investors and citizens better into this agenda. So far, we have done some marginal progress in this. I mentioned the eco-label. I mentioned the requirement for retail investors to be, or investment advisors to ask the questions whether there are any preferences by retail investors in ESG. But here we can go further. We can explore other actions. One particular promising area that we are exploring is digital sustainable finance and how to reap benefits and synergies between the 2 key priorities of the European Union, which is digitalization and sustainability. And there are many very useful, practical, best practice examples that can inspire our work. Finally, I mentioned all the public stimulus and the public interventions. And there will be a lot of new opportunities stemming from these packages at member states and EU level. And we need to find ways how, again, these tools that we are developing for the private sector can be better used by the public authorities. So at the end of the day, everything is aligned better. And finally, I mean, the international dimension that you see at the end is extremely important. We should not forget that this agenda is super relevant also for emerging markets and developing countries. So we are developing some ideas how investors can make a difference, not only in the developed countries, but to help and to support the transition of the emerging markets and developing countries. Finally, this is almost the end. I talked about the risks. We are talking about the new tools and instruments, not only for supervisors, how to manage risks, but in the first place, how these risks can be managed by institutions themselves, by finance, by banks, by insurance companies. We are looking at the way how credit rating agencies mainstream sustainability in the way how credit ratings are being developed and assigned. And finally, I talked a lot about resilience that you see at the end of this slide. For us, this area really needs to be advanced much faster than until now, especially in the view of the need to look at these issues from a better systemic, more systemic point of view. Finally, and I really promise this is my final slide, the international dimension of this work is really critical. We have been thinking hard in the European Union how to connect better with other jurisdictions in the world on how we can partner better and how we can exchange views who is doing what. Because currently, unfortunately, or at least until the end of last year, there was no forum where jurisdictions that are very keen on promoting sustainable finance, where they can discuss who is doing what and how to facilitate the work of global investors and financial sector community to accelerate their action. And last year, this was the initiative of the European Union. We initiated to create this international platform on sustainable finance. You see all the jurisdictions on this slide. Currently, they are representing essentially half of global emissions, global GDP, and half of world population. This club is currently working on mapping who is doing what in terms of taxonomies, the green bond standards, and disclosure. And is very open when it comes to the membership. The ultimate goal of this platform is to see where these tools and frameworks can converge. So it's not only a talking club. The ultimate objective is to see how these frameworks can again find a common denominator so that the global investors who have global activities can really make a big impact, not only in their own country, but elsewhere, while minimizing the costs. This club is open. There is a lot of interest by many other countries, and we are very open. The decision ultimately is obviously for the whole club. It's a club of willing. It's basically working on the similar principles like the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a club of supervisors and central banks. This club, this International Platform of Sustainable Finance, is a club of public authorities that are in charge of developing sustainable finance frameworks and tools. So as you see, it's a very ambitious agenda. I am sorry that I have exceeded a little bit slightly the time given to me, but sorry if I have exhausted you too much, but this is what I have been asked to do. So Dave, back to you.
Martin, thank you very much. That was extraordinary and an excellent presentation of the scope and comprehensiveness and ambition of the EU as it relates to sustainable finance. We have a number of questions, and one of those has to do with the climate benchmarks. You mentioned the Paris-aligned and transition benchmark, and the question is adaptation considered or incorporated in some way, shape, or form in the benchmarks? And perhaps you could give a example of how these benchmarks would actually be applied or used.
Thank you very much, Dave. Well, these two types of benchmarks are mainly targeted towards the first objective, which is the climate change mitigation. It's really about how to reduce the carbon emissions rather than the adaptation. I mean, of course, these benchmarks can be used for a variety of different purposes. But the main idea beyond these two benchmarks is basically how to reduce the carbon emissions rather than how to adapt to the impact of climate change. The logic of the first benchmark is really to have stocks in the basket that, again, are not necessarily carbon neutral today. That would be very naive to expect. But companies who have a very tangible record of the decarbonization over time. And there, the minimum requirement is essentially at least 7% every year. So it's kind of a parallel. Be on a diet if you want to be in the basket. The second benchmark is really about having stocks that are already currently more or less aligned with the Paris goals. This is super ambitious. We have a good reason to have this benchmark, but the number of stocks that would qualify for the second one is not particularly impressive for the time being. When you mentioned the climate adaptation, I think that the most important tool for the climate investments to facilitate and support climate adaptation is the taxonomy where again the second objective is really about how to promote investments into projects that are limiting the impact of climate change on businesses, on societies, and on our economy. And obviously the needs that I referred to were stemming only from the decarbonization for the first objective. We have not yet calculated and made precise the number of the investment needs for the climate adaptation. And you can imagine that these numbers are really extremely high.
Sticking with the taxonomy, another question poses the following challenge. The questioner indicates that the taxonomy-related disclosures apply to EU companies, but certainly there may be portfolios, investors' portfolios or funds that have both investments in EU companies as well as non-EU companies. And so in the absence of data for the non-EU companies, what's an investor to do?
Well, indeed, there are two types of requirements in the taxonomy regulation. The first one is for financial market participants, if they sell their product with the claim that the product pursues sustainability, green sustainability objectives, or environmental characteristics, they have to disclose to what extent and how they have used taxonomy in determining that this is the case. It's true that for the big listed companies in the European Union, they will get this information because they are subject to a similar requirement under the taxonomy regulation. But the taxonomy regulation doesn't cover companies that have activities elsewhere than in the European Union that are not captured by the non-financial reporting directive, to be more precise. And there it's really for the investors to see with the companies whether they can get this information, and if they cannot, well, then they have to be transparent about that in their disclosure. So we are not asking somebody, to fudge the information provided. Absolutely not. We are aware that there is a limitation what financial sector can do, but again, that's why the requirement for the disclosure is reasonable, and it says, please say whether and to what extent you have used taxonomy. And if it was not feasible to use taxonomy to determine that the product is green, well, then the investor has to explain what other factors have played a role in concluding in the conclusion that the product is green and sustainable. So that there is something, in exchange. I mean, if you cannot really use taxonomy, you have to explain what else you have used in order to demonstrate that your product is really essentially green.
Another question that underscores the challenge associated with not having acceptance of the EU approach internationally, though they used to be commended for establishing the international platform to try to accomplish just that. But the question is, has the EU considered, with regard to its approach to fiduciary obligations, if and how fiduciaries outside the EU conduct themselves if they're investing in EU securities?
Well, again, we have to be clear about the scope of our legislation. I mean, the legislation in the European Union, when it comes to the disclosure regulation, which is again the piece that I referred to earlier, requires financial market participants to disclose how they comply with fiduciary duty when they sell products within the European Union. So those financial market participants that are having their activities and selling the products in the European Union are captured by this rule. We are not capturing entities that are having activities that are based and headquartered in the United States and have activities in the United States. However, if there is an investor that has a subsidiary in the European Union and is selling the product in the European Union, it has to comply with those rules.
And I take it that for corporations in the real economy, if there are U.S. corporate entities that have subsidiaries in Europe, their subsidiaries will have to comply with the various requirements of the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan.
That's correct. Companies that will be subject to the non-financial reporting directive that are listed, for instance, in the European Union, and that are again captured by the scope of the non-financial reporting directive will have to report whether and to what extent their activities are taxonomy compliant. I mean, not necessarily fully. The requirement that is introduced in the law says that the big listed companies' non-financial undertakings have to disclose the proportion of the revenues that they are generating from activities that would be taxonomy compliant. That's the first information. And the second information is the proportion of CapEx and OpEx that would be taxonomy compliant. And the rationale for this second element is to have a more forward-looking perspective. It's not only about static where you are today, but the CapEx and OpEx would tell you where the company wants to go. And you can even have a very polluting company that doesn't generate any revenues from taxonomy compliant activities, but can still engage in CapEx and OpEx, at least part of it, that would be taxonomy compliant. And that's a very important information for investors who might wish to invest in companies who are currently currently brown and polluting, but that have a plan to become greener over time.
So one question also is the determination by the EU to have a green taxonomy that focuses on the classification of economic activities that are positive across one of the 6 categories and certainly not negative in the 5 others. But why was the decision not made to also have a brown taxonomy? And I note that there's some reference to this being a potential path in the consultation document.
The first reason was a very pragmatic one. We are very ambitious about the project, as I have presented, but we have to be also pragmatic and we have to be reasonable what can be achieved within the first 2 years. And as I mentioned, it basically has taken almost 2 years to develop the green climate taxonomy. We still have basically 1 year to develop taxonomy for the other 4 environmental objectives, and we are still talking about green taxonomy. So it was a matter of sequencing. And second element was that we really wanted to present this agenda as an enabling agenda, as a positive agenda. And we did hear a lot of concerns from the companies that if we start kind of blaming and shaming those that are operating or having activities in the polluting sectors, that it would be kind of unfortunate. So we also thought how to, in the first place, articulate the usefulness of taxonomy as a useful tool, not only for finance, but also for businesses, for the transition. So we have taken a really positive approach to this, rather than the punishing and shaming and blaming approach. But when it comes to the future, this is not yet excluded. I mean, even in the taxonomy regulation itself, there is indeed a hook that requires the Commission to report to the European Parliament and the Council already, I think, in next year, about the merits of extending the green taxonomy to taxonomy that would capture economic activities that would provide substantially harming effects. And finally, we are asking some questions on this also in our consultation that is currently online. I should also say that 2 days ago, we received the feedback and contribution from the European Central Bank to our consultation, and the European Central Bank deemed very important that this brown taxonomy would be developed rather quickly. So
another question,
interesting perspectives.
That's actually, that is very interesting to learn. Another question, the questioner points out that the requirement for corporate disclosures is in Q1 2021, or at least proposed, while the financial sector will need to disclose by March 2021. So the question is, will there be sufficient data available for the financial sector to make ESG disclosures consistent with the strategy and the plan?
Well, it's true that we are currently working on the details of this regulatory piece. I mean, we call it level 2. You see it on the slide, so-called regulatory technical standards. Currently, these details are under consultation by the European supervisory authorities. Everybody can have access to that. I'm happy to circulate it. And the idea is that the details will be worked out and finalized before the end of the year, so that ultimately the Commission can transpose it into the legally applicable acts, so that the effect can really be already visible in March 2021. We do admit, and we have heard some concerns of some stakeholders, that this timeline might be very ambitious. But again, in light of the challenges we are facing on the environmental, social, and governance aspects, these challenges are high as well. So there have to be some efforts on all sides.
Here's a question about the just transition mechanism. How will it function? Will it disperse funds through the European Investment Bank and the European Regional Development Bank to member states, or will the Commission opt for other means of disbursement or finance of the funds?
The just transition mechanism was proposed earlier this year together with the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan, which was again basically the first concrete action of the European Green Deal. The Just Transition Fund is currently being negotiated. So the final design of this Just Transition Fund will still have to be decided. But the main purpose of the Just Transition Fund was to make sure that the countries that face the most significant challenges with the transition, and especially some regions that have obviously over the long term developed a high dependency on, for instance, coal or gas, that those regions that will face those challenges will be supported, and that the social aspects will be duly taken into account, so that nobody is left behind. We cannot suddenly, move from one type of economy that we have today to another in half a year. So the purpose of this Just Transition Fund is indeed to support member states, especially those that face the most significant challenges and the social coherence challenges in their regions. Again, on the final design, it's really difficult for me to say how this would work, and because the details are still being negotiated.
A question about how the plan and strategy applies to the insurance sector. Certainly insurance companies are investors, and so in their capacity as investors, a lot of what you've described will have applications, but insurers as underwriters of insurance, does the taxonomy or any of the other elements of the action plan have implications for insurers as underwriters of insurance?
Yes, I mean, on this slide, I should have said that the green ticks indicate to you where we have proposed some legislative action. And basically all of them, with the exception of action number 4, have been already adopted. So action number 1, taxonomy, action number 5, sustainability benchmarks, and action number 7, the disclosure by financial market participants, they have been already politically agreed, with the exception of taxonomy that will be formally adopted later this month. Where the insurance companies would be affected is basically action number 1, because they would be captured clearly by the disclosure requirements under the taxonomy. They would be captured by the suitability test, which is action number 4, which requires not only investment advisors, but also insurance distributors to ask their clients about preferences, which is the IDD, we call it Insurance Distribution Directive. And then finally, and that's really very important, the disclosure 7, ensuring explicitly covered by the disclosure requirements of this piece. Finally, action number 8, you don't see the green tick there, but I talked a lot about the banks and the insurance companies, and not only about the prudential rules, but also about the risk management and transparency. And we are currently working on the review of the Solvency II framework, which is the legal framework governing the operation of insurance companies in the European Union. And this review will incorporate a lot of work on sustainable finance into the EU law. This review will be very likely completed next year.
With regard to financial regulators, I'm wondering whether there is any additional work contemplated with regard to developing a Brown penalizing factor associated with capital adequacy requirements for financial institutions that say are lending into Brown economic activity that may face various climate-related risks such as transition risk, or conversely, a green supporting factor for regulators to apply with regard to, say, capital adequacy requirements associated with, say, banks making loans into the green economy.
That's correct. We are working on both together, especially, I mean, the European Banking Authority is working on both, I should say. On the green supporting factor, we are exploring, in particular, whether, for instance, energy efficient mortgages would ultimately provide for a lower probability of default of borrowers. And if there is sufficient evidence, again, we have not yet concluded that there is, we might consider whether there will be a merit in adjusting the prudential requirement. But here I really have to say that the guiding principle for any adjustment in the prudential and regulatory framework and capital framework really needs to be risk driven. So the risk perspective will always be the driving factor. And on top of it, the sustainability or degree of sustainability will be additional consideration. Vice versa, you asked me about the Brown penalizing factor. We are now exploring, and the European Banking Authority is exploring, whether there is a case that supervisors should apply an extra capital charge under Pillar 2 in case the bank has on its balance sheets assets that might prove to be unsustainable, and especially in the scale that might put the bank into difficulties over time. I talked about the long-termism, so the need to also have a longer-term perspective of the assets on the bank's balance sheets needs to be more and better integrated by the supervisors. Currently, the ECB is running a consultation on the guide on managing climate and environmental risks. I'm going to speak on an event on this next week, and it's a very promising avenue to tackle those issues.
Fantastic. Well, I see that we're coming up on the hour, and I think that we promised a very, very comprehensive and thorough and information-filled hour-long webinar, and Martin, you have delivered exactly that. I want to thank you and the European Union for providing this opportunity for those of us here in the States to learn more about the Sustainable Finance Strategy, Action Plan, and Renewed Strategy. I want to thank my colleagues at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at UC Berkeley School of Law for their assistance in hosting this as well. And I want to thank everyone who took time to join the webinar, either directly or via YouTube. I would encourage you to take advantage of learning more about the incredible work that the EU is doing. And you can do so by clicking the link on the registration confirmation. As well, we have a number of emails from those that registered, and I believe we'll try to push out the slides and other links to information that's on the EU website. And if you didn't register and you're watching on YouTube, we'll try to make available information about where you can go to access the slides or otherwise avail yourself of information. So, Martin, thank you very, very much. Incredibly impressive forward-thinking and ambitious work by the EU and to grapple with an existential threat that we're all facing. And we deeply appreciate the EU's leadership and your leadership and your willingness to spend some time with us today. Thank you.
Dave, thank you very much for the opportunity. And I really would like to invite everybody, please provide your feedback to us. We don't really claim that we have all the answers to the issues and challenges we are facing. We do need to be connected to everybody who would like to contribute. So you have a great chance to contribute to our consultation. The deadline again is mid-July, and I really count on your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you.